The city spent more money putting together the land that they then turned to FCA for free than it spent on running the city health department that year.
That's the voice of John Mozena. Detroit's comeback in economic development across Michigan has come hand in hand with large tax and property incentives. Earlier this year, on episode 277 of the podcast, I talked with the head of the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, Kevin Johnson, about just that. Obviously, Johnson is a fan of using incentives, and that was a good conversation. Well, on today's Daily Detroit, the other side of the argument. I'm Jer Stays. John Mozena is the president of the Center for Economic Accountability. They're a nonprofit education and advocacy group that is for free markets without corporate welfare and central planning. We'll get to it right after this. Daily Detroit is brought to you in part by Digital Summit Detroit. It'll be September 25th and 26th at Cobo Center. The lineup includes Seth Godin, NBA Hall of Famer Dennis Rodman, Rand Fishkin, plus 55 in-depth digital marketing, design, and strategy sessions from YouTube, Ford, Quicken Loans, Cars.com, and many more. Visit DigitalSummitDetroit.com for more information and use promo code DD50 to save $50 on any ticket. We're also brought to you by listeners like you. You can get on the Daily Detroit bus at patreon.com/dailydetroit. And thanks. There are a ton of incentives, whether it is that mega skyscraper that Dan Gilbert's talked about building downtown, whether it's the Chrysler plant that's happening. We spent a lot of time covering that. They're moving to the east side. They're creating a lot of jobs. So what's the problem?
The problem is that overwhelmingly, the evidence is that all these incentives, all these subsidies, all these different economic development programs, they go to companies to do what those companies were going to do anyway. So there's a lot of various factors that go into something like building an automotive manufacturing plant or expanding one, or building a skyscraper, or any of the other things that the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation or the Michigan Economic Development Corporation or any of these other entities hand out. There's dozens of factors that go into making some sort of multi-billion-dollar decision. The incentives, sometimes they matter. More often than not, they don't, in terms of actually changing a company's decision-making process. But the problem is, while they might not be big enough necessarily to truly make the difference in what like an FCA or a Dan Gilbert's going to do, they are big enough to actually incur significant costs on our communities and really create problems in terms of our ability to pay for all the other things that our government is supposed to pay for that benefit everybody and not just a few big corporations.
Well, outside of a few of them, for the most part, at least what we're told, is that these incentives are things on money that wouldn't happen anyway, right? The idea, at least that's what we're told, is that this economic development wouldn't happen anyway. So if we give some of the tax money back to the company, so like what often happens is say they'll have a new plant and the money will come in and they'll say, okay, instead of that tax revenue going to the state, it's actually going to go to the corporation, like that income tax revenue that's generated or that whatever tax revenue. Why doesn't that work?
It's like a sale at a store is a good example. Think of how many times, you've bought something that was on sale and you thought you liked it, it was a good deal. Incentives are basically the city or the state putting our community on sale. Think back to how many times you went to a store that you wouldn't have shopped at and bought something you would not have bought just because it was on sale. Well, no, because there's a lot of things that you look at. Is it the right size? Is it something I like? Is it a brand I trust? Is it going to do the job? Just the same, there's dozens of factors. Everything from workforce is actually the primary factor that goes into any company. That's what the research shows. Workforce, what's the broad general tax rate? Because these cuts aren't going to last forever. Are my suppliers here? Are my customers here? What's the infrastructure like? What's the quality of life like? Can I attract people? Is it safe or not? Do I have access to the transportation networks I need? If you're a manufacturer, you're probably going to want rail. Is there water nearby for, area development magazine, which is sort of the magazine of the site selection industry. Every year, they actually survey companies around the country, as well as the site selector consultant folks, as to what factors actually matter to them. And they come up with basically sort of 23, 25 factors that at least half the companies out there that are making big decisions like skyscrapers and plants and whatnot, that they say matter. Of those, say, 25 factors, at least half of them call very important, the kinds of things that really impact their decision. Only 3 of them at all even vaguely relate to economic incentives. So like, yes, incentives matter. Yes, sort of the ability of the local government to help with long-term financing matters. But, there's dozens of other factors that also play into the decision. So the research shows from the Upjohn Institute out in Kalamazoo, very famous, nonpartisan, just straightforward research institute. They looked at all of the research that's been done on this question. It's called the but-for argument. But for the incentives, what would have happened? And what they found is that at least 3/4 of the time, businesses would make the same exact decision without the incentives. They go asking for the incentives because they're there and everybody likes free money, but it's not the actual thing that makes the difference.
But incentives are deployed across the country. This is not just a Michigan or Detroit thing. Why is America so addicted to incentives as opposed to maybe just creating a pro-investment playing field, say with your tax code? Like one of the things when I look at businesses starting in the city of Detroit, when we cover especially, say, smaller businesses, they have to charge so much more than their competitors in the suburbs. They almost have to go high end because their other costs are so high in the city, whether it's property taxes, all those other things. Why do so many municipalities, and I don't want to just pick on Detroit because it happens across the country, why doesn't it just be an investment friendly or a fair tax system? Why do we lean so much on incentives?
Quite frankly, this gets to the fundamental problem with all these programs. I joke that, economic development incentives don't exist to create jobs. They exist to make voters believe that politicians are responsible for creating jobs. So it's a lot harder for a politician whose first job is to get reelected to stand in front of voters and say, vote for me. I created a broad, fair tax base that is widely welcoming to new businesses and that incentivizes, incremental growth year over year in our population or whatever. It's a lot easier for them to stand at the, groundbreaking or ribbon cutting for some big new plant and take credit for having created 3,000 and some odd jobs.
So let's get into, say, some of the specifics around some of the city projects. Where does the math fall apart? Because when I talked to the head of the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, he said to me, the math works. Like all this money being spent, it works because there's people who are getting jobs in the community. He wouldn't go into specifics. He wouldn't bust out the piece of paper. But he says, well, it's worth it because these jobs are held by residents. And so therefore it's basically all going to, in fact, he used the word trickle down.
Yeah. And again, that whole argument assumes that FCA wouldn't have done this or effectively this anyway. So first off, you have to take them at their word that this would have happened anyway. And since everybody claims that they would have done it, but the research shows that 3/4 of the time they wouldn't. So somewhere there's a disconnect there when people say that, well, of course the incentives make all the difference in this. According to a Cranes wrap up, FCA is going to get about $319 million total in state and local incentives and free land and workforce training and all these other things that they've got there.
That's a key point too, is that the city actually gave them a bunch of land, acquired, repurposed, repackaged, and gave them land.
The city spent more money putting together the land that they then turned to FCA for free than it spent on running the city health department that year. Goes to the point of this is real money that actually matters and that, could be real things could be done with that. That's not foregone taxes. That's an actual money out of the pocket of Detroit that could use some money here or there. But $319 million total in all of the various things over the course of years for 3,850 new jobs, assuming that actually happens. The statistics are that usually those estimates are off, sometimes by half, sometimes by a third, but it's really rare that anybody actually creates the jobs.
Well, we only have to look down the road at the GM Hamtramck plant to see things that large projects that get lots of incentives. In fact, whole neighborhoods get erased, and now there's a question to even still be around.
Yeah, that's. I was actually going back and trying to find some of the quotes from when they built quote Pole Town, and man, did they sound similar to the claims that were being made about Jefferson North today. But again, if you go back to the 319 million, 3,850 new jobs, that's over $82,000 per job created. I'm going to go ahead and assume that if you took that same amount of money and spread it around to those small businesses that you were talking about that are having trouble making it, that they could create just as many, if not many more jobs in the city if you took all that money and then either didn't take it out of their pockets in forms of taxes or gave it to them in some other form of program. I mean, Small and medium-sized businesses are where economic growth happens. It's where job growth happens. I mean, just read the headlines. You rarely see major company to hire 40,000 people. No, it's like major company to lay off 40,000 people. Job growth happens when small companies, and then they stop being small companies because they've grown.
I mean, at $82,000 a pop, that sounds like basically they're getting the first year of that worker for free.
Yeah, well, more so because the actual cutoff figure for how much they have to pay these people each year is a hair under $60,000. So it's a year and change. Well, yeah, you give any business the ability to hire a worker for free for a year, they're gonna create jobs. Of course they are. That's the overwhelming issue is that this is real money. These are real costs getting incurred by these programs. This isn't just fake money that, oh, well, it wouldn't be there anyways, because that whole argument assumes that nothing ever would be done with any of the land, any of the properties, any of the assets in the city other than for these incentives. So unless you believe that nothing ever would have happened in Detroit without incentives, somewhere the math doesn't work.
Well, that gets me to my next question. I have talked to a lot of business people who believe that the incentives kickstart psychological momentum, that they create a story where it's like, well, if Chrysler is going to invest there, someone else will invest there too. Or if Dan Gilbert does the thing there, somebody else will do it too. And that nothing would have happened? Or do you think that doesn't compute?
I think that doesn't take into account the realities of finances for what big businesses look like. So FCA is getting potentially up to a total of $319 million for this one plant. They're spending $2.5 billion-ish. I don't remember the exact number that they're promising to put into it. It's going to be a huge engine economically for their company. They've got to put a plant somewhere to build the cars and trucks that they're going to sell, or else they're going to be out of business. The same quarter that they announced this deal, first quarter in 2019, they announced a quarterly profit of $567 million, which was, they said, going to be their lowest profit of the year. That same quarter, they announced the sale of the Magneti Marelli division for $6.5 billion. They're not going to make a decision about where to put one of their sort of crown jewel manufacturing enterprises based on $319 million, all other things being equal, compared to all that money out there. I mean, I spent, before I got involved in the sort of the nonprofit advocacy world, I spent 20 years in private sector marketing and PR jobs, mostly around Metro Detroit, around the country as well. And I represented downtown development authorities. I represented organizations that got incentives. And with all due respect to my former clients and colleagues, I joke that I might not know where the bodies are buried, but I probably wrote the press releases about the gravedigger jobs that got created or retained. I got to see from the sausage making how much the incentives did or didn't change things based on what I knew the company's plans already are. I mean, I remember talking to one CEO of a publicly traded company. This wasn't in Michigan, this was someplace else. And I said, you're sort of a free market guy. Why are you taking these things? And he's like, well, yeah, it's not changing our plans. I mean, maybe it makes us move a little bit faster. He's like, but my shareholder, it's free money. My shareholders would fire me if I didn't take it, and they'd be right to. I'm like, oh, okay, fair enough. That's the reality. More often than not, these deals don't actually make the difference. They're a factor. I'm not saying that they're completely meaningless, but they're one of 20, 30, however many factors that companies look at, whereas they are treated by the DEGC, by the MEDC, by the others out there as the thing that made the difference, when in fact they're just, one of dozens of factors that played it. And so you have to then take that into account when you're figuring out, are they worth it? Well, if there were, say, 20 factors that went into the decision for the FCA plant, and one of them was incentives, if there were 19 factors and they didn't get the incentives, would they have done the same thing or functionally the same thing without taking $319 million out of the state and local coffers, without spending more on land than we spent on the health department, et cetera, et cetera? There's just increasing amounts of evidence from all over the political spectrum that these deals just don't make a difference. They don't work, and you just cannot justify them. There's a famous piece from the University of Iowa where this guy said, at the end of the day, 90% of these deals are bad and 10% are good. Problem is, you can't tell ahead of time what the 10% are going to be. That, to me, is bad math, and I think there's a lot of other things that we could be doing with those resources and doing to actually create a Detroit that works for every business, not just sort of the politically favored few. And I think that gets to your point about, the small business, how hard it is to start up a business, how challenging it can be, especially in an environment like this where it's hard to find people, where all of a sudden you're competing with some subsidized Fortune 500 corporation for the same people. How are you going to do that? How are you going to be able to do good work with that?
So one of the things that's coming up on the horizon is some renewals of some laws. And this is going to get really wonky for our listeners, but I know that our listeners kind of love this a little bit. What exactly is happening? Because there was an interesting op-ed in Bridge Magazine that kind of I think it caught my eye as somebody who covers it. And I know it caught yours kind of well, these incentives do a great thing, but there's actually a piece of legislation, a law that's about to sunset. Can you talk to us about why you think that's important?
Sure. It's the name of the legislation is Good Jobs for Michigan. I tend to refer to it as Good Jobs for Politicians. It was legislation passed toward the end of the Snyder administration that created a new economic development tool, unquote, for the state. And it was really designed to be something that was aimed at big projects. It was aimed at Foxconn. It was aimed at Amazon. And I think that anybody who looks back and now looks at what's going on with Foxconn in Wisconsin, where it's an absolute disaster, and then looks at the clown show that has been Amazon's whole back and forth with New York and then with the DC area, can be glad that we actually dodged those bullets and didn't end up with those deals. Bridge Magazine, you mentioned, they actually went through and ran the numbers, and they said fairly recently that by their math, it's costing $42,000 per job that's been promised to be created, and not actually created yet, but promised to be created under that program. Among other things that law did is it actually sets up a system where workers are effectively paying their income taxes not to the state government, but rather to the corporation that employs them or the developer that's building the building. The Chrysler plant as an example, 10 years of 100% state income tax capture from the workers employed in the building over a certain salary range. That's the first time that Michigan's ever put in place a situation like that, where income tax got diverted away from the state and back towards private business. And that was a pretty big change that happened without a lot of people understanding it. It involves not paying sales taxes on the construction materials, and given that sales tax is the way that we primarily fund education in the state, that's kind of a question that people should probably talk about. In order to get the law passed, the sponsors at the time had to agree to sunset it. The law ends at the end of calendar 2019, December 31st. And as you said, the op-ed in Bridge made a lot of us think that there's a little nervousness on the MEDC's side and the Michigan Strategic Fund side and the people who benefit and profit from that they're seeing the fact that there is this really interesting sort of not even nonpartisan, but sort of transpartisan consensus growing up against renewing it. I come from sort of the limited government free market side of things. I was a vice president at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. I talked to folks who are, sort of on the quote right, unquote. But on this, I'm, side by side with folks on the left, progressive. This is a topic where National Review, the conservative magazine, wrote a column. We finally found something we agree with Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez on, and it was about her opposition to Amazon in New York. This is a topic that doesn't break on the right to right-left spectrum. It's much more sort of on the us versus them spectrum, whether you want to call it populist or whatever. But there's a very interesting sort of consensus growing among people who are sort of, you can dislike big government or you can dislike big business, but we can all agree that when the two of them get together, it's not a great idea for the rest of us. And there's a consensus growing up against the legislature passing the new law and the governor signing the law to extend that Good Jobs for Michigan legislation.
All right, so let's have some real talk here. But if we don't do this, then aren't we going to lose these things? Isn't this going to kind of throw a wrench into all of this economic development happening? There's a lot of folks who might say, well, yeah, we don't want to give this to the companies, but we want jobs. What's the numbers behind all this?
The first answer is that, no, the jobs aren't all going to go someplace else, because these programs aren't making the difference in why the jobs are here in the first place. But even if we got rid of the Good Jobs for Michigan, that's one tiny piece tiny in the grand scope of things. It's still a lot of money, tiny piece of what the state and the local governments already spent. I mean, all told, just in tax abatements, not subsidies, not training, but just in terms of pure how much money they are not taking in taxes every year because of economic development deals. State and local combined in Michigan is $944 million. That is, almost $1 billion. That's real money. State budget, the last state fiscal report said that the state alone had abated just over $760 million. That is, again, nobody knows what that means. That's more money than we spend on running the entire Michigan State Police every year.
Well, I think about this in the context of this big road funding debate.
Exactly. I wrote a piece in Cranes a couple months ago saying, like, hey, you want a place to start? Let's take off and nuke the MEDC from orbit. It'll take a while for that all to unwind because a lot of that's under contracts that you can't get out of, but at least it's a starting point. Or, that same amount of money, you talk about the road funding debate. Again, $764 million in abated taxes. The total amount of money that MDOT spends every year on wages and benefits for all of its employees, plus all the materials, plus all its equipment, is $570 million. You could run MDOT wages, benefits, materials, equipment, and then throw in the entire Department of Agriculture and Rural Development and still have money left over on just the tax abatements. And that's a tiny shred of all of the economic development spending. So yeah, if we get rid of good jobs for Michigan and take that little bit of money and put it back into the economy where everybody can benefit from it rather than just these few companies, there's still plenty, in fact, way too much economic development spending. And, it's not going to make the jobs go someplace else.
Well, John Mozena, thank you so much for stopping by and making us think. This has been an interesting conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's always good to talk to people when you start actually showing some of the numbers. People's eyes get real wide. I always enjoy that moment. Like, yes, this is a real problem.
All right, thanks for listening to Your Daily Detroit. I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.